Hi, welcome to the Silent Avenger channel. If you're enjoying the content, please consider giving it a like and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Let's dive into today's story. I never thought I'd find myself in this position, sitting at the kitchen table, staring at divorce papers and a mountain of evidence that my wife Jean had been cheating on me. But here I was. The signs had been there for months. Late nights at work, guarded texts, the sudden need for privacy, and the distance that had grown between us. I ignored them at first, convincing myself that maybe I was imagining things. But then 2 weeks ago I found the proof, a receipt for a motel stay, dated the same night she claimed to be out with her friends. I hired a private investigator to confirm what I already knew in my gut. It didn't take long. Photos, timestamps, even a name, Dan, some guy she worked with. They weren't exactly discreet: motel rendezvous, cozy dinners, hand-holding in public like teenagers who thought no one was watching. It was all there, in glossy 8x10 prints sitting in an envelope on my table. The kind of evidence that could rip a man apart if he wasn't already numb from weeks of suspicion. That night, I started preparing for the divorce. It felt clinical, like organizing my life into boxes labeled before Jean and after Jean. I reached out to a lawyer, a friend of a friend named Carla, who came highly recommended. Sharp, straightforward, and no nonsense, Carla assured me she'd handle everything. "We'll make this as painless as possible, George," she said over the phone, her voice steady and firm, like a rock I could cling to. The hardest part was hiding it from Jean. Every morning, I plastered on a neutral expression, nodded when she talked about her day, and acted like I wasn't dying inside. The anger and betrayal sat heavy in my chest, but I refused to let her see me crack. Not yet. I thought that would be the hardest part. But then last night, the police showed up at my door. It was just past 10 p.m. when the knock came. I was sitting on the couch, trying to focus on a baseball game, but the numbers on the scoreboard blurred together, my mind too tangled in everything that had happened. I thought it might be a neighbor or maybe even Jean, since she hadn't come home yet. Part of me hoped it was her. I was ready for another excuse, another lie I could quietly file away while counting down the days to the end of this sham of a marriage. But when I opened the door, it wasn't Jean. 2 uniformed police officers stood there instead. One was a middle-aged man with a clipboard, the other was a younger woman with a tense expression. They didn't look like they were here to talk about noise complaints or some lost dog. My stomach dropped. "Mr. George Connors?" the man asked. "Yeah," I said, gripping the edge of the door. "I'm Officer Marks, and this is Officer Hill. May we come in?" "What's this about?" My voice cracked, which I hated. I stepped aside, letting them into the entryway. My mind was racing. Did Jean get caught stealing? Did she get pulled over for drunk driving? I didn't know what to expect anymore. "We need to inform you that your wife, Jean Connors, was involved in a shooting earlier this evening," Officer Marks said. His tone was measured, like he'd said something like this 100 times before. A what? My head spun. Whatever I expected, it wasn't this. "She's alive," Officer Hill said quickly, maybe noticing how pale I'd gone. "She's at St. Mary's Hospital, recovering from a gunshot wound to her shoulder. She's stable." Wait. I shook my head. What the hell happened? Where was she? Officer Marks exchanged a look with his partner before answering. "She was at the Mountain View Motel, involved in an altercation with another woman. That woman, Mary Sullivan, fired the shot." Mary Sullivan? I repeated the name, completely blank. It didn't click at first. But then I remembered, the last name matched Jean's lover, Dan Sullivan. "Wait," I said, realizing it out loud. Dan Sullivan. The guy she's been seeing, his wife. Another long pause. I could feel the pity in their expressions, which somehow made it worse. "Yes, sir," Officer Marks said. "We understand this may be a lot to process." A lot to process? That was an understatement. My wife had been shot by her lover's wife at a motel. I didn't even know what to say to that. The room seemed to shrink, like the air had been sucked out. My heart was racing, but I didn't feel panicked. I felt angry. Angrier than I'd ever been in my life. Not just at Jean, but at the whole damn situation. At the embarrassment. The lies. The absurdity of it all. "What happens now?" I managed to ask, keeping my voice steady. "Mary Sullivan is in custody," Officer Marks explained. "We're still gathering details, but it seems there was a confrontation between your wife and Mrs. Sullivan at the motel. Witnesses report a verbal altercation escalating into violence. Mrs. Sullivan pulled a handgun and fired one shot. We're still investigating the circumstances. And Jean? I asked, my jaw tightening as her name left my mouth. What's her story in all of this? She hasn't been able to give a formal statement yet, Officer Hill said. But we can keep you updated. I nodded, barely listening anymore. I could feel my grip on the situation slipping. Part of me wanted to jump in the car and go to the hospital, but another part, the louder part, felt like I didn't owe her that. She'd made her choices. She'd lied. She'd cheated. And now, the mess she'd created had come crashing down on both of us. Why the hell should I pick up the pieces? Is there anything else you need from me? I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. No, sir. We just wanted to inform you, Officer Marks said. If you have any questions, here's my card. He handed it to me, but I barely looked at it. Thanks, I muttered, ushering them toward the door. Have a good night. The officers hesitated, like they wanted to say something else, but they didn't. Once they left, I stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door. My hands were shaking, though I wasn't sure if it was from anger, shock, or some twisted mixture of both. She'd been shot. My wife, the woman I'd shared 10 years of my life with, was lying in a hospital bed because she couldn't keep herself out of trouble. I wanted to feel bad for her, but all I could think about was how she'd betrayed me. How she'd blown up our life for some sleazy affair. And now, she dragged me into this circus too. I sat back down at the table, staring at the divorce papers. Part of me wondered if I should hold off, wait for her to recover. But no. That was the old George talking, the one who believed in forgiveness, in working things out. That George was gone. I picked up my pen and signed my name at the bottom of the document. Done. Whatever happened next, I was moving forward without her. I didn't sleep that night. I tried, turned off the lights, laid down, even tried counting sheep, but every time I closed my eyes I saw Jean. Not Jean as I knew her, but Jean with a bullet in her shoulder, arguing in a motel parking lot with some furious woman holding a gun. It didn't seem real. Then I'd think about the motel, about what she was doing there before it all went south. That part wasn't hard to figure out. By morning, I had more questions than answers. What exactly went down at that motel? Why was Mary Sullivan there? Did Jean even know Dan's wife? Was this some love triangle nonsense or something even messier? I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Around 9 a.m., my phone rang. It was Carla, my lawyer. I heard the news, she said, cutting straight to the point. Are you okay? Define okay, I muttered. Jean's recovering, apparently. Police came by last night to let me know. Right, Carla said, her tone sharp and focused. This complicates things. The media might pick this up if it hasn't already, and if they dig into your divorce filings. Wait, I interrupted. You think this is gonna hit the news? She sighed. A shooting involving infidelity? At a motel? It's got all the makings of a tabloid headline. I don't want to alarm you, but we should be prepared. Great. Just great. As if my life wasn't messy enough. Now there was the possibility of becoming the guy on the 6 o'clock news because his wife couldn't keep her drama private. What do I do? I asked, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. Stay quiet. Don't talk to anyone about it. Not the press, not mutual friends, no one. If anyone asks, refer them to me. And don't go to the hospital, George. That last part caught me off guard. Why not? Because it sends the wrong message, she explained. Visiting her could suggest you're willing to reconcile. It muddies the waters legally. Plus, this isn't your problem to fix. Jean's actions led to this mess, and you need to keep your distance. She wasn't wrong. Carla never was. Still, part of me wrestled with the idea of staying away. Jean was still my wife, at least on paper. Despite everything, the idea of her lying in a hospital bed, dealing with the fallout of her own mistakes, tugged at something deep inside me. It wasn't love, not anymore, but maybe some leftover sense of responsibility. Or guilt. I couldn't tell which. All right, I finally said. I'll stay away. Good, she replied. Focus on the divorce. We'll get through this. After I hung up, I tried to take Carla's advice and get back to business. I started going through our financials again, double-checking everything before filing. But my focus was shot. My thoughts kept drifting to Jean, and then to Mary Sullivan, the wife with the gun. What had driven her to snap like that? Was it the cheating, or something more? I got my answer that afternoon when Jean's sister, Laura, called me. We hadn't spoken much since I'd found out about the affair, but she'd been civil, almost apologetic, as if she blamed Jean as much as I did. "I assume you've heard," Laura said, skipping any pleasantries. "Yeah. The cops came by last night." She sighed heavily. "This whole thing is insane, George. I just left the hospital. Jean's awake, but well, let's just say she's not handling it well." I wasn't sure what to say to that, so I stayed quiet. "Listen, there's something you need to know," Laura continued, her voice low. "Mary Sullivan didn't just show up at that motel by accident. She's been following Jean for weeks." "What?" I said, sitting up straighter. "What do you mean?" "Jean said she noticed Mary at the grocery store once, then at the gym another time. She thought it was a coincidence, but now," Laura trailed off, like even she couldn't believe what she was saying. "Turns out Mary hired someone to track them. She knew about the affair for months and was just waiting for the right moment to confront them." I felt a chill run down my spine. It was one thing to cheat, another thing entirely to get caught in a full-blown domestic thriller. "And Jean didn't think to tell me about this?" Laura scoffed. "She didn't even tell me until now. Typical Jean, thinking she could handle everything herself. Look where it got her." "Unbelievable," I muttered. "Yeah, well, you're better off without her," Laura said bluntly. "I just thought you should know. Mary Sullivan's out of her mind, but Jean's not exactly innocent here." After he hung up, I sat there in stunned silence, piecing everything together. Mary had been watching Jean. She'd known about the affair for months. And Jean, well, she just kept lying, even when her life was unraveling around her. For the first time in days, I felt something close to clarity. This wasn't my circus, and these weren't my monkeys. Jean had made her choices, and now she was dealing with the fallout. My job was to keep my head down, finalize the divorce, and get the hell out of this mess before it dragged me down any further. I didn't owe her anything, not my sympathy, not my presence, not my help. And yet, part of me still wondered what she would say if I showed up at the hospital. By the next day, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling sitting in my chest. Laura's words kept playing in my head. Mary Sullivan had been following Jean, tracking her movements, waiting for the right moment to strike. That wasn't just a heated confrontation at a motel, that was premeditated. And Jean, for all her lies and betrayal, was still lying in a hospital bed because someone decided to pull the trigger. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was the guilt, maybe the need for answers, or maybe I just wanted to see her face when she explained how everything had gone so far off the rails. Whatever it was, I found myself pulling into the parking lot of St. Mary's Hospital that afternoon, even though every logical part of me screamed to turn around. The front desk gave me her room number without question. As I walked down the sterile white hallway, I felt an odd mix of anger and dread bubbling up. What was I expecting? An apology? An explanation that would somehow make this mess less humiliating? Or just a chance to tell her, face to face, how thoroughly she'd wrecked everything we built? Her room was at the end of the hall. I paused at the door, staring at the name on the placard, Jean Connors. I hated that it still said Connors. It felt wrong now, like an insult to the man I used to be. I knocked softly before stepping inside. Jean was propped up in bed, her arm in a sling, her face pale and drawn. Her usual polished look was gone, no makeup, messy hair, hospital gown. She looked smaller somehow, like the weight of everything had finally sunk in. When she saw me, her eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought I saw relief flash across her face. "George," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't move closer. I stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, keeping my distance. "Jean." She swallowed hard, her good hand fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. "I didn't think you'd come." "Yeah, well, neither did I." My voice was sharp, colder than I intended, but I wasn't here to coddle her. "What the hell happened, Jean?" Her gaze dropped to her lap. "It's complicated. Try me." She hesitated, then let out a shaky breath. Mary showed up at the motel out of nowhere. She was furious, screaming at me, calling me every name in the book. I tried to calm her down, but she wouldn't listen. She just kept yelling about how I ruined her marriage, how I deserved to pay for what I'd done. I clenched my jaw, trying to stay composed. What exactly did you think was going to happen, Jean? You were sneaking around with her husband. Did you think she'd send you a thank you card? She flinched at my tone, but I didn't care. I was done tiptoeing around her feelings. I didn't know she'd been following me, Jean said defensively. I had no idea she'd been tracking us. She pulled a gun, George. She could have killed me. But she didn't, I said flatly. You got lucky. Doesn't change the fact that you put yourself in this position. You lied to me, and now you've dragged both of us into this circus. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel a shred of sympathy. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Didn't mean for it to happen? I snapped, my voice rising. You made choices, Jean. Over and over again. You lied, you cheated, and now you want to play the victim because it backfired on you? You don't get to do that. She looked away, tears streaming down her face. I know I screwed up, okay? I know I hurt you. But I'm the one lying here, George. I'm the one who got shot. I laughed bitterly. And that's supposed to make me feel sorry for you? You got shot because Mary Sullivan found out what kind of person you are. I didn't put you in that motel. You did. For a moment, the room was silent except for the hum of the machines around her. Jean didn't say anything, just wiped at her tears with the back of her hand. I felt the anger start to fade, replaced by a hollow exhaustion. Why, Jean? I asked finally, my voice quieter now. Why did you do it? Was I not enough for you? She looked up at me then, her expression crumbling. It wasn't about you, George. It was me. I felt stuck. Bored. Like my life was going nowhere, and I didn't know how to fix it. So you blew it up instead, I said, the bitterness creeping back into my voice. She nodded, her face crumpling. I'm sorry, George. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I am. For everything. I stared at her, trying to decide if I believed her. Maybe she was sorry. Maybe she wasn't. Either way, it didn't matter. The damage was done, and there was no going back. I hope you mean that, I said finally. Because when this is over, I don't want to hear from you again. Her head snapped up, panic flashing in her eyes. George, wait. But I didn't wait. I turned and walked out of the room, ignoring the sound of her voice calling after me. Whatever guilt I'd felt about not visiting her was gone. I'd done my part. I'd seen her, heard her excuses, and said what I needed to say. Now it was time to move on. Walking out of that hospital room felt like ripping off a bandage I'd been clinging to for years. The wound was raw and exposed, but it was finally starting to heal. Jean's face as I left, the desperation, the regret, stayed with me for the rest of the day. I couldn't shake it, but not for the reasons you'd think. I wasn't second-guessing myself. I wasn't sad. I wasn't even angry anymore. I was disgusted. Not just with her, but with the person I'd become by staying with her for so long. I let her lies slide for years. All those late nights when she came home with flimsy excuses and I swallowed them whole. The times I'd catch her being secretive with her phone, or when she'd brush off my questions with a laugh and a kiss. I let myself believe that we were just in a rut, that we could fix it. And for what? So she could end up sneaking around with some sleazebag and almost get herself killed? I spent the rest of the day avoiding everything. My work, my lawyer, even my phone. I just drove aimlessly, trying to clear my head, but everywhere I went, it felt like there was some reminder of Jean. The coffee shop we used to go to on Saturdays. The park where we'd walked our dog before he passed. The street where we'd taken Christmas photos last year. It was like I couldn't escape the ghost of my old life, even though I wanted nothing more than to bury it. Around 6, my phone buzzed. I ignored it at first, figuring it was Carla checking in or Laura wanting an update. But it kept buzzing, one notification after another. Finally, I pulled over and checked it. It was a group chat, mutual friends of mine and Jean's. The notifications were screenshots of an article someone had sent. My stomach sank as I clicked the link. There it was, scandal at the Mountain View Motel, local woman shot during confrontation over alleged affair. My name wasn't mentioned, thank God, but Jean's was, along with Mary Sullivan's. The article painted Mary as the scorned wife who snapped and Jean as the other woman. Dan Sullivan got a passing mention as the man at the center of the alleged affair. It was the kind of trashy, sensationalized piece you'd expect from a gossip site, but the damage was done. Within minutes, texts started pouring in. Old friends, distant family, people I hadn't heard from in years. Most were asking if I was okay, but a few were just nosy, fishing for details about the drama. I felt like a bug under a microscope. I thought about calling Carla, but what could she do? The article didn't name me, and I wasn't involved in the shooting. Still, the shame of being attached to this train wreck weighed on me like a boulder. And then, as if things couldn't get worse, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was Laura. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she said when I answered. "Yeah." She sighed heavily. "Jean's freaking out. The hospital staff told her about it. Apparently someone on the inside leaked it. She's convinced her life is over." I pinched the bridge of my nose, trying to keep my frustration in check. "What does she want me to do about it?" "Nothing," Laura said quickly. "I just thought you should know. She's talking about holding a press conference or something, trying to set the record straight." I let out a bitter laugh. Set the record straight? What's she gonna say? That she wasn't having an affair? That Mary imagined the whole thing. "I know," Laura said, her tone weary. "I told her it's a bad idea, but you know Jean. She's not exactly great at thinking things through." "No kidding," I muttered. There was a pause on the other end of the line, then Laura spoke again, softer this time. "Look, George. I know you're done with her, and I don't blame you. But I'm worried about her. She's spiraling. She's made some awful choices, but she's still my sister." "I get it," I said, though I wasn't sure I really did. "But she made this bed, Laura. Now she's got a lie in it." "I know," she said quietly. "Just keep an eye on the news, okay? I have a feeling things are gonna get messy before they get better." She wasn't wrong. That night, I sat on the couch, staring at the TV, but I wasn't really watching. My phone kept buzzing, but I ignored it, letting the messages pile up. I didn't want to talk to anyone, not about Jean, not about the article, not about the circus my life had become. But as much as I tried to push it all away, one thought kept creeping in. How the hell had it come to this? A decade of my life gone. My marriage destroyed. And now, thanks to one night at a motel, my name was getting dragged into a mess I had nothing to do with. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, waiting for the next disaster to hit. The next morning, the chaos kicked into high gear. I woke up to 20 missed calls and over 50 unread texts. The group chat was still buzzing, and someone had sent a link to a local news clip. My chest tightened as I hit play. There she was, Jean, standing at a podium outside the hospital, a sling cradling her arm. Her hair was neat, her makeup perfectly done, and she was wearing this soft, sympathetic expression like she was the victim of some tragic misunderstanding. Behind her was Laura, looking stiff and uncomfortable, along with some PR-looking guy who was probably hired to manage the narrative. Jean started speaking, her voice soft and trembling in just the right way. "First, I want to say how deeply sorry I am for the pain this situation has caused to everyone involved." She paused, looking down for effect. "What happened at the motel was a terrible, unfortunate incident, but it's not the full story. I've made mistakes, yes, but I never deserved what happened to me." I felt my jaw tighten. Classic Jean, accepting just enough blame to look remorseful, while still playing the victim. She continued. "I want to clarify that I was not the aggressor that night. I was meeting a colleague to discuss a work matter when I was ambushed by someone who had been misled about my intentions." I nearly dropped my phone. A work matter? Was she serious? I rewound the clip to make sure I hadn't misheard her. Nope. That's exactly what she'd said, with a straight face, to the cameras. She was trying to rewrite the whole story, spinning herself as some innocent bystander who just happened to end up at a motel with a married man. The reporters started shouting questions as soon as she stopped talking. "Were you having an affair with Dan Sullivan?" one asked. Jean hesitated, then leaned into the microphone. "Dan and I are colleagues and friends. Anything beyond that has been exaggerated or misunderstood." I laughed out loud, a bitter, humorless sound. Misunderstood? There were photos, timestamps, receipts. How could she stand there and lie so boldly? Another reporter cut in. "Do you feel responsible for what happened?" Jean glanced at Laura, as if waiting for approval, then said, "I think there's enough blame to go around, but I also believe the actions taken against me were extreme and unjustified." Extreme and unjustified. That was rich, coming from the woman who'd been sneaking around with another woman's husband. I turned the video off before I threw my phone across the room. The nerve of her, standing there with crocodile tears, trying to salvage her image while I was left to deal with the fallout. What was worse was that some people would believe her. There would always be those who saw a tearful woman in a sling and thought, poor thing. By lunchtime, my phone was still lighting up with messages. Carla finally called, her voice tinged with irritation. "George, have you seen Jean's little performance this morning?" "Yeah," I said through gritted teeth. "It's a circus. It's also reckless," she said. Her statement opens up a lot of questions. If this goes to court, and it might, given that Mary Sullivan is already facing charges, Jean's words could be used against her. She's making it worse for herself, and by extension for you. Why me? I snapped. I'm out of this. I've got nothing to do with her mess. That's what we're trying to establish legally, Carla said, her tone clipped. But with the press circling, someone's bound to dig deeper. You're still legally married, George, which makes this your mess, whether you like it or not. I let out a long breath, trying to keep my frustration in check. So what do I do? Lay low, she said firmly. Don't talk to the media, don't engage with anyone who brings this up. Focus on the divorce. The sooner we finalize it, the sooner you can officially distance yourself from this disaster. Fine, I muttered. Just get it done. We're almost there, Carla assured me. Hang tight. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, dodging calls and trying to stay off social media. But around 5 p.m., a knock at my door pulled me back to reality. I froze, half expecting a reporter or worse, Jean herself. But when I opened the door, it was Laura. She looked exhausted, her hair pulled back in a messy bun and dark circles under her eyes. We need to talk, she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. What now? I asked, shutting the door behind her. Jean, she said, sinking onto my couch. She's spiraling, George. That press conference? It wasn't even her idea. That PR guy? Dan hired him. My stomach dropped. Dan. Laura nodded. Apparently, he's worried about his own image. He told Jean they needed to present a united front. She didn't want to do it, but Dan pushed her into it. And she just went along with it? I said, shaking my head. Unbelievable. She's not thinking clearly, Laura said. She's terrified, George. She's afraid of losing everything. Her job, her reputation, you. I laughed bitterly. She lost me the second she decided to sleep with Dan Sullivan. Laura winced but didn't argue. I know. I thought you should know the whole picture. I crossed my arms, leaning against the wall. And what am I supposed to do with that information, Laura? Feel sorry for her? Step in and clean up the mess she made? No, she said softly. But you deserve to know what's going on. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry, George. For all of this. Her apology caught me off guard. I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded. Laura stayed for another hour, mostly venting about how Jean wouldn't listen to reason. I let her talk, more out of politeness than anything else. When she finally left, I felt drained, like I'd been sucked into Jean's chaos all over again. I wanted out. Out of the marriage, out of the drama, out of the life I thought I'd built with Jean. And I was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen. The next day, I was sitting in the kitchen, trying to get through a cup of coffee that tasted as bitter as I felt, when my phone buzzed again. The caller ID stopped me cold. Mary Sullivan. At first, I thought it was a mistake or maybe even a prank. But curiosity got the better of me, and I answered. Hello. George, her voice was sharp, almost impatient. This is Mary Sullivan. We need to talk. I didn't say anything for a second. Of all the people I expected to hear from, Mary was at the bottom of the list. Okay. Why? Because your wife and my husband have dragged both of us into their little circus, and I think it's time we compared notes. I leaned back in my chair, unsure where this was going. I'm not sure what good that'll do, I said carefully. Mary's voice hardened. You think I wanted this? To end up in the middle of a scandal because my idiot husband couldn't keep his pants on? Look, I'm not here to fight you. I'm here to fix this before it gets any worse, for both of us. She had a point. As much as I hated the idea of dealing with any of this, Mary's no-nonsense tone made me think she wasn't interested in dragging things out either. Fine, I said after a pause. What do you want to know? Everything, she said, but not over the phone. Meet me tomorrow. Coffee shop on Main. Noon. She hung up before I could respond, leaving me staring at my phone. Mary Sullivan, the woman who shot my wife, wanted to team up. This wasn't where I expected my day to go. The next day, I showed up at the coffee shop, unsure if I was walking into a productive conversation or a trap. Mary was already there, sitting in a corner booth with a black coffee in front of her. She looked composed, almost cold, like someone who'd already calculated every move. "George," she said as I slid into the seat across from her. "Mary," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She studied me, probably trying to figure out what kind of man I was. I did the same, noticing the steely look in her eyes that hinted at why she had no problem pulling the trigger. "I want to end this mess quietly," she said finally, leaning forward. "No more headlines, no more drama. But to do that, I need to know what Jean's planning." "I'm not sure she knows what she's planning," I said honestly. Mary's lips pressed into a thin line. "Typical. Look, Dan's got lawyers breathing down my neck, and I need to know if Jean is going to back him up. If she does, it'll only make this uglier for everyone." I hesitated. Jean's in survival mode. She'll do whatever makes her look better. Mary smirked bitterly. "Sounds about right." The conversation didn't last long. We exchanged what little information we had, both agreeing on one thing: we wanted this to end. As I walked out, I couldn't help but feel like Mary was more dangerous than I realized. And somehow, I was now tangled even deeper in this mess. After my meeting with Mary, I drove home with a knot in my stomach. She wasn't what I expected: calm, calculating, and far too composed for someone who'd just been arrested for shooting her husband's mistress. She wasn't interested in apologies or excuses, she wanted solutions. And that unsettled me. When I got home, Carla was waiting on my voicemail. Her tone was clipped, straight to business. "George, we need to discuss some developments with Jean's public statements." "Call me." I called her back immediately. "What now?" I asked, sinking into my couch, exhausted. "Jean's press conference stirred things up more than you might think," Carla said. "Dan Sullivan's camp is already pushing a narrative that paints her as an unstable home-wrecking liar." I scoffed. "So now she's the villain in his story?" "It's damage control," Carla explained. "Dan's protecting himself. If this goes to court, and I suspect Mary will try to make it happen, then Dan's lawyers will do everything they can to throw Jean under the bus. That includes painting her as the aggressor in the affair. They'll say she manipulated him, pursued him, and tried to sabotage his marriage." The absurdity of it all made me laugh bitterly. "So now she's a scapegoat, too. Great. She's a liar, but I know for a fact she didn't force him into a motel." "I know," Carla said. "But the court isn't about the truth, George. It's about what you can prove. And right now, Jean's public image is fragile. If Dan's team builds a strong enough case, it could affect the divorce proceedings." I felt my stomach turn. How does any of this tie back to me? I've got nothing to do with her choices. Legally, you're still married. If she's dragged into court for defamation or anything else, you could get pulled in as collateral damage, financially or otherwise. That's why we need to finalize your divorce as quickly as possible. What's the holdup?" I asked. "She's dragging her feet on signing the paperwork," Carla said bluntly. "And now with all this going on, she might stall even longer, especially if she thinks staying married to you could help her case." I gritted my teeth. "So she's going to use me as a shield?" "It's possible," Carla said. "But don't worry. We have options." That night, I couldn't shake the weight of Carla's words. Jean was becoming a bigger liability by the day, and now I had to worry about her turning my life into a bargaining chip. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "George, it's Dan. We need to talk." I stared at the screen, disbelief flooding through me. First Mary, now Dan? Was everyone in this disaster hellbent on dragging me deeper into it? Before I could decide whether to ignore him or reply, another text came through. "I know you hate me, and you should. But this is bigger than us. Call me." I tossed my phone onto the table, feeling the anger bubbling up again. Dan Sullivan had the nerve to ask for my help after everything? After sleeping with my wife and blowing up both our lives? I didn't respond. Instead, I poured myself a drink and sat in silence, wondering how much worse this could possibly get. The next morning, I caved. Against my better judgment, I called Dan Sullivan. I didn't want to, but the curiosity of what he thought he had to say got the better of me. He picked up on the first ring. "George, thanks for calling." His voice was calm, like we were old friends catching up. It made my skin crawl. "What do you want, Dan?" I said, my tone cold. "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from," he began. "But this situation is spiraling, and if we don't get ahead of it, it's going to destroy both of us." "Both of us?" I repeated bitterly. "You dragged me into this when you decided to sleep with my wife. Don't lump me in with your mess." "I get it, okay," he said quickly. "But hear me out. Mary's lawyers are coming for me, and Jean's press conference only made things worse. If this goes to court, it's going to get ugly fast, for everyone involved. Including you." I clenched the phone tighter. "What does any of this have to do with me?" "If Jean keeps pushing her narrative, she's going to make herself a bigger target," Dan said. "And since you're still legally tied to her, you'll be collateral damage. Financially, reputationally, it doesn't matter. I need her to back off, George." "Then tell her yourself," I snapped. "I'm done cleaning up after her." Dan hesitated. "She's not listening to me. But she might listen to you." I laughed bitterly. "You think I have any sway over her after what she did? You're delusional." "Maybe," Dan admitted. "But I'm telling you, if this doesn't settle quietly, you're going to regret it as much as I will." I hung up without saying another word. Dan was right about one thing: this was spiraling. But if he thought I was going to save him, or Jean, from the fallout of their own stupidity, he was dead wrong. 2 days passed before Jean called me. I almost didn't answer, but some part of me, maybe curiosity, maybe masochism, picked up. "George," she started, her voice thin and tired, "I need to talk to you." "What now, Jean?" I said, already dreading whatever she was about to say. There was a long pause, and then she said, "I need your help." I couldn't help but laugh, bitter and sharp. "You need my help? That's rich." "Please, George," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know what to do. Dan's pushing me to go along with his lawyers, and Mary's threatening to take everything from me. I'm stuck." "Maybe you should have thought about that before sneaking around behind my back," I shot back. "I know I screwed up," she snapped, her frustration breaking through the desperation. "But this isn't just about me anymore. If this goes to court, they're going to drag you into it too. Do you want that?" Her words hit a nerve. Carla had warned me about this exact scenario, and now it was staring me in the face. "I'm finalizing the divorce, Jean," I said coldly. "After that, you're on your own. This is your mess." "I get that," she said quietly. "But until then, we're still connected. Please, George. I'm asking for your help, just this once." I sighed, rubbing my temple. "What do you want me to do?" "Meet with me," she said quickly. "Just talk to me. Please." I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to slam the door on her completely, but another part, the part that still felt some lingering sense of obligation, wavered. "Fine," I said finally. "But don't think for a second this changes anything." "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. I hung up, already regretting my decision. We met at a small park near our old house. It used to be one of our spots, back when things were simple, before all the lies and betrayal. Jean was already there, sitting on a bench, her arm still in a sling, and a nervous look on her face. I sat down, keeping a good amount of space between us. "All right, I'm here. Talk." She fidgeted with the edge of her coat. "First, I want to say I'm sorry. For everything. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to hear it." "Jean," I said flatly, "I didn't come here for an apology. What do you want?" She took a deep breath. "Dan's lawyers are pushing me to stick to the story we told at the press conference. That we were just colleagues and friends. And Mary's lawyers are claiming I pursued him, that I manipulated him into the affair to ruin their marriage," she said, her voice trembling. "They're building a case to paint me as the villain. If that happens, it's going to ruin me, George." "Why do you care what happens now?" I asked. "You made your choices, Jean. You didn't care about the fallout then." Her eyes filled with tears. "I care now, okay? Everything's falling apart. My job, my reputation, it's all slipping away. And now Mary's coming after me like I'm the only one to blame." "You're not the only one to blame," I said coldly. "But you're not innocent either. You're trying to save yourself, Jean, not fix anything." She didn't deny it. I know I can't undo what I did to us, George. But please, help me end this quietly. If this turns into a legal battle, it'll get dragged out for years, and I can't." She stopped, her voice breaking. I stared at her, trying to feel something, sympathy, pity, even a flicker of the love I used to have. But all I felt was exhaustion. "I'll think about it," I said finally, standing up. "But don't hold your breath." She looked up at me, hope flickering in her eyes. "Thank you." I didn't respond. I just walked away, feeling like I'd given her more than she deserved already. The next day, I told Carla about the meeting with Jean. Her reaction was exactly what I expected, sharp and straight to the point. "You shouldn't have met with her," she said, her voice firm over the phone. "Anything she says or does right now is about self-preservation, not about what's best for you." "I know," I admitted, leaning back in my chair. "But she's scared, Carla. She's unraveling." "That's her problem," Carla said bluntly. "Not yours. George, the longer you let yourself get pulled into her mess, the harder it's going to be to separate yourself from it. You need to stay focused on finalizing the divorce." I sighed. She said if this goes to court, it'll get dragged out. "I don't want to deal with that, Carla. I just want to be done with this." "That's why I have a proposal," she said. "Jean hasn't signed the divorce papers yet, but if we offer her a clean break, a no-contest agreement where you waive certain claims, she might agree to sign quickly. It's not ideal, but it gets you out faster." "Waive claims?" I asked. "What does that mean?" "You be forfeiting any financial claims, like spousal support or shared assets," Carla explained. "It's not fair, but it's a way to end things quietly without giving her an excuse to stall." I thought about it. Losing money wasn't ideal, but the thought of being tied to Jean any longer made my stomach turn. "If it gets her to sign, let's do it." Carla hesitated. "Are you sure?" "It's not an easy decision." "I'm sure," I said firmly. "I just want this over with." "All right," she said. "I'll draft the new terms and send them over to her lawyer. Let's hope this gets her to cooperate." For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. If this worked, I'd finally have a way out of the chaos Jean had dragged me into.